I can still hear her voice echoing in my ears as if it happened yesterday. My only daughter standing in the doorway of the home I once built with my husband, her face twisted with anger, her words cutting deeper than any knife could. "Go live in the woods, you useless old woman." In that moment I felt my entire world collapse. I had lost my husband only weeks earlier, and I thought I was clinging to the one thing that could hold me steady, my family. But instead I was being cast out like garbage, tossed aside by the very child I carried, raised, and sacrificed everything for. I left that house with nothing but a bag of clothes and trembling hands. The mansion, the money, the life I once knew gone. She had it all now. And me? I was given an old cabin in the middle of nowhere. A place most people wouldn't look at twice. A place she wanted me buried in, forgotten. But what my daughter never imagined was that the same cabin she mocked me with, the same cabin she thought would break me, held something inside that would turn her world upside down. I walked into that dusty cabin with tears staining my face, convinced my life was over. I thought I had lost everything. I thought Richard, my husband, had left me with scraps. But as the days passed, as I peeled back the silence of those wooden walls, I began to discover secrets. Secrets Richard had carefully hidden. Secrets meant only for me. Secrets that would not just change my life, but would leave my daughter shocked to her core. And if she knew then what I know now, she would have never screamed those words at me. She would have never dared throw me out. This is the story of love, betrayal, heartbreak, and the kind of quiet revenge no one ever sees coming until it's too late. Stories like mine are painful to share, but if you've ever felt betrayed by someone you love, please give this video a like. It tells me I'm not alone, and it helps more people hear this story. Before everything fell apart, I believed I had the kind of life people would envy. I had a husband who worked tirelessly to provide, a home filled with warmth, and a daughter I thought would carry our values forward. My husband, Richard, was steady in every sense of the word. He wasn't the kind of man who chased after excitement or grandeur. He built his life brick by brick, carefully, thoughtfully, always keeping me and our daughter, Emily, at the center of his world. Richard and I had been married for over 3 decades. In those years we built more than just a house. We built traditions. Friday evenings meant family dinners, no excuses. We would gather around the dining table, and Richard would tell Emily stories about his own childhood. She would laugh at his descriptions of growing up with little more than a baseball glove and a stubborn dream. Sometimes she would roll her eyes, pretending she was tired of hearing the same stories, but I could always see the corner of her lips curve upward. Even when she was too proud to admit it, she loved those nights. Holidays were our sacred time. Every Christmas morning, Emily would come running down the stairs. Even when she was well past the age of believing in Santa, Richard always played along, pretending to be surprised at what Santa had left under the tree. I remember the year she asked for a pony. She was 12, with stars in her eyes, convinced that her father could conjure up anything she wanted. And when Richard gently explained that a pony wasn't something we could keep in the backyard, she crossed her arms and sulked for days. That was the first time I noticed her disappointment ran deeper than just the wish of a child. As Emily grew older, I saw flashes of a girl who believed she was destined for more than what we could give her. Richard and I came from modest beginnings. We believed in saving, in working hard, in appreciating what you earned. Emily, on the other hand, often talked about wanting a life where money wasn't a concern. She wanted the newest clothes, the most expensive phone, the kind of vacations her friends at school bragged about. Richard would shake his head, telling her, "Emily, life isn't about what you own. It's about who you are." She would nod, but I could tell the words didn't always land the way he hoped. I told myself it was just a phase, a young girl's desire to fit in, to prove herself in a world that seemed to value wealth above kindness. But there were moments, small, sharp moments, that made me wonder, like the time she invited friends over for dinner, and when Richard proudly served his homemade chili, she whispered to me, embarrassed, "Why couldn't we order takeout like normal families?" Or the afternoon she asked if we could redo the kitchen to look more like her friends, who had granite countertops and stainless steel everything. She was 15. It seemed harmless at the time, but now looking back, those were cracks in the foundation I refused to see. Still, for all her longing, Emily had moments of genuine sweetness. She would sit beside me when I worked in the garden, asking me about each flower, pretending to be interested in my love for roses. On Mother's Day she would make me cards, filled with glitter and messy handwriting, promising to always take care of me. And when Richard came home late from work, exhausted but smiling, she would run to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, declaring, "You're the best dad in the world." I held on to those moments as proof that whatever shadows I sensed, love would always pull us through. Our family trips were the glue that held us together. Summers spent at the lake, with Emily begging her father to let her steer the small rowboat. Winters where we drove upstate just to see the snow. Even when the car heater barely worked and our fingers felt frozen. Those were the days I believed we were untouchable, that no matter what challenges came, we would face them side by side. But time has a way of testing what you think is unshakable. I began to notice that as Emily stepped into adulthood, her gratitude lessened, and her expectations grew. She wanted more, always more. Richard, patient as ever, kept reassuring me that she would find her way, that deep down, she knew what truly mattered. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to the picture of us sitting together at the dinner table, laughing over nothing, feeling like the world outside our door could never touch us. I didn't realize then that the life I cherished so deeply was fragile, that every smile, every warm memory, every promise could be undone in a single moment. The signs were there, subtle but undeniable. The distance in Emily's eyes, the way she flinched when we reminded her of responsibility, the casual comments about what she thought she deserved. I ignored them. I told myself all families had their struggles, and that love would always outweigh disappointment. How wrong I was. The perfect life I thought I had was not perfect at all. It was built on assumptions, on blind faith that my daughter would carry the values Richard and I poured into her. I thought love was enough. I thought family was unbreakable. But soon, I would learn that even the strongest bonds can shatter. And when they do, the pieces cut in ways you can never fully heal. When I think back to the months leading up to Richard's passing, it still feels unreal, as though life shifted without asking me if I was ready. One moment, he was mowing the lawn with the same steady hands that had built our home from the ground up, and the next, he was struggling to catch his breath after climbing a single flight of stairs. At first, we both brushed it off. He told me he was simply tired, that age had a way of slowing a man down. But the cough lingered, the weight dropped, and the spark in his eyes dimmed little by little, until even I couldn't deny something was wrong. The hospital became our second home. I can still see the sterile white walls, hear the beeping machines that never seemed to rest, and feel the chill that settled into my bones each time the doctors pulled me aside. They used words like treatment plan and managing expectations, but I could hear the truth beneath their careful phrasing. Richard was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I sat by his bedside every single day, holding his hand, whispering prayers I wasn't even sure I believed in anymore. Even as his body weakened, his spirit remained unshaken. He would smile at me, thin and fragile but still filled with love, and say, "Don't you worry, Margaret. You've always been the strong one. You'll carry us through." His faith in me was unwavering, but inside I felt myself crumbling. I wasn't ready to face a world without him. I wasn't ready to let go of the man who had been my partner, my confidant, my anchor through every storm. Emily visited, but not as often as I hoped she would. She always had an excuse: work, friends, errands that couldn't wait. When she did come, she brought flowers, kissed her father's forehead, and stayed just long enough to snap a photo or two. Richard never complained. He seemed content just to see her, to hear her voice. But I couldn't ignore the distance in her eyes, the way she glanced at her watch as if she had somewhere more important to be. I wanted to shake her, to make her understand that these were the final days, that she would never get them back. But I held my tongue, telling myself she was coping in her own way. The last night with Richard is etched into my soul. The machines hummed softly, the world outside his hospital room was quiet, and the air felt heavy with unspoken words. He reached for my hand, his grip weaker than it had ever been, and whispered, "Promise me you'll be okay. Promise me you'll live, not just survive." Tears streamed down my face, blurring everything in front of me. I nodded, unable to find the strength to speak. He gave me a faint smile, the same smile I had fallen in love with all those years ago, and then he closed his eyes for the last time. In that instant, the world stopped. The silence in the room was deafening, and the emptiness that followed felt like a chasm opening beneath my feet. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to beg him to come back, but all I could do was sit there, holding the hand that had held mine for over 30 years, realizing it was now lifeless. I had prepared myself for this moment, or at least I thought I had, but nothing could have truly readied me for the finality of death. The days that followed blurred together. Funeral arrangements, endless phone calls, and a steady stream of condolences that sounded more like rehearsed lines than genuine comfort. People said, "He's in a better place," and, "At least he's not suffering anymore," as if those words could stitch together the hole in my chest. I smiled politely, thanked them, and went back to my empty bed each night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a sleep that never seemed to come. It was during those days of grief that small shadows of unease began to creep in. The lawyer called more than once, insisting I come into the office to go over Richard's will and finalize paperwork. His voice was calm, professional, but there was an urgency I couldn't quite place. I wasn't ready to deal with legal matters. I barely had the strength to get out of bed. But the lawyer reminded me gently that these were Richard's wishes, and they had to be honored. When I sat in his office, staring at the neat stacks of documents and the pen poised in my trembling hand, I felt overwhelmed. Pages upon pages of legal terms blurred together, and though the lawyer explained each step, my grief made it impossible to focus. I signed where he pointed, initialed where he directed, and tried not to think about what it all meant. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet question stirred. Why had Richard left me with so many details to navigate alone? He was always so careful, so thorough. He would have known how difficult this would be for me. Emily came with me once, but her focus was sharp, almost eager. She asked the lawyer pointed questions, leaning in as he flipped through the documents. I noticed the way her eyes lit up when numbers were mentioned, the way she pressed for clarity on accounts and properties. At the time, I told myself it was her being responsible, stepping up when I was too broken to manage. But a part of me couldn't ignore the flicker of something else, a hunger I hadn't seen before, one that unsettled me in ways I didn't want to admit. Even in my grief, I began to sense that the loss of my husband was not the only storm I would face. There were whispers in those papers, hints in the lawyer's measured tone, and questions in Emily's restless gaze that left me uneasy. But I was too consumed by sorrow to piece them together. All I knew was that my world, once anchored by Richard's steady presence, had been shattered. And in that fragile state, I could not yet see how much more I was about to lose. The day of the will reading arrived sooner than I was ready for. I remember walking into the lawyer's office, a place that smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, with my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The room was lined with shelves of thick books I knew I'd never understand, each one filled with rules and laws that seemed far removed from the life Richard and I had built together. I had always imagined that if I ever found myself in such a place, it would be for something ordinary. Maybe the sale of a car or the purchase of some land. Never this. Never the division of a life's worth of love and labor. Emily sat beside me, her posture upright, her face carefully composed. She wore a dress that looked a little too polished for the occasion, as though she were attending a celebration instead of the closing chapter of her father's life. She tapped her nails against the armrest, an impatient rhythm that set my teeth on edge. I wanted to take her hand, to remind her that this was not about money or property, but about honoring her father's memory. But when I looked at her, her eyes were sharp, focused and distant, as though she were waiting for a performance to begin. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses before opening a manila folder stuffed with documents. His voice was calm, professional, almost detached, but to me, each word carried the weight of finality. As per Richard Anderson's last will and testament, he began, his assets will be divided as follows. My breath caught. This was it. This was where my husband's voice would echo through paper and ink, where I would hear what he had decided for the family we built together. The first words hit like a brick. To my daughter, Emily Anderson, I leave the family residence and all accounts associated with it, totaling $5 million. I blinked, convinced I had misheard. My ears rang, drowning out the rest of the sentence. $5 million. The home we built together. The life we shared. All placed in Emily's hands. I turned to look at her, hoping for some sign of humility, of gratitude, of recognition that this was far more than anyone her age should be entrusted with. But instead, she smiled faintly, the corner of her mouth curling upward in a smirk that twisted my stomach into knots. The lawyer continued, his voice unshaken. To my beloved wife Margaret Anderson, I leave the cabin located on Willow Creek Road, with all its contents, to be her sole property. His words seemed to echo in the room, heavy and sharp. A cabin. That was it. Not the house I had poured my life into, not the money we had saved so carefully, not even a portion of what Richard and I had worked for over 3 decades. An old cabin in the woods. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the chair as though it were the only thing holding me upright. My face burned with confusion and humiliation. 1,000 questions racing through my mind. Why would Richard do this? Did he not trust me? Did he believe I couldn't manage what we built? Or worse, had Emily somehow convinced him she deserved it more? I searched the lawyer's face for answers, but his expression was neutral, practiced, and unreadable. Emily, on the other hand, could not hide her triumph. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms with the ease of someone who believed the world had given her exactly what she was owed. When our eyes met, she didn't look at me with sympathy or understanding. Instead, she raised her eyebrows, almost daring me to protest. Well, she said softly, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I guess Dad knew who could really handle things. Her words stung more than anything the lawyer had spoken. I wanted to speak, to argue, to demand an explanation, but my throat tightened and no sound came out. My heart ached, not just from the loss of what I thought was mine, but from the realization that my daughter, the child I had carried, nurtured, and protected, was no longer on my side. She wasn't grieving her father. She was celebrating her inheritance. The lawyer slid papers toward us, asking for signatures, initials, confirmations. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen, staring at the neat lines where I was expected to reduce my life to ink on paper. Every stroke felt like a betrayal, not of Richard but of myself, of the woman who had stood by his side, who had shared every burden, only to be left with so little. I thought of the cabin, dusty and forgotten, tucked away in the woods like a memory no one wanted. That was what Richard had left for me. An afterthought. A remnant. I tried to make sense of it, to believe there must be some hidden reason, some logic buried in his decision, but all I felt was the sting of shame and the weight of Emily's eyes on me, filled not with love but with quiet triumph. As we left the office, Emily walked a step ahead, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She glanced back at me once, her lips curling into a smile that was anything but kind. "Don't worry, Mom," she said, almost laughing. "The cabin will suit you just fine. You always liked quiet places, didn't you?" Her words cut deeper than she could ever know, because in that moment, I realized the daughter I had loved so fiercely no longer saw me as her mother. She saw me as someone to be dismissed, someone to be pushed aside. I stepped out into the cold air, the city buzzing around me, but I felt utterly alone. I clutched my purse tightly, as though it were the only thing I still owned, and tried to steady my breathing. The world looked the same, cars honking, people rushing by, but mine had shifted forever. I had walked into that office as a wife, a mother, a partner in a life carefully built. I walked out feeling like a stranger in my own story. Have you ever been blindsided by the very people you trusted most? Leave me a comment below. I read every single one, and your stories remind me why I'm sharing mine. After the will was read, I still clung to a thin thread of hope, fragile but alive. I told myself there had to be a misunderstanding, some oversight that could be corrected if only I spoke with Emily directly. Surely, once she realized how little I had been left with, she would see reason. She was my daughter, my only child. I believed that blood, history, and love had to mean something. They had to count for more than money or property. So I swallowed my pride and approached her one evening in the house that had once been mine, the home I had helped build brick by brick, the one whose walls held my laughter, my tears, and every memory of Richard. I found her in the living room, lounging comfortably on the sofa, her phone in her hand and a glass of wine on the table beside her. She didn't even look up when I entered. "Emily," I began softly, my voice wavering. "We need to talk about this arrangement." She sighed, tossing her phone aside with an exaggerated motion. "What arrangement?" she asked coolly. "The will," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "Your father left me with only the cabin, and, well, you know that's not enough. I don't need everything, Emily. I just need a little security, a place to stay, maybe some of the savings to cover my expenses. We could share, you and I. That's what families do." For a brief second, I thought I saw her expression soften, but then she laughed. A short, sharp laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Share," she repeated, as though the very word were ridiculous. "Mom, you don't get it, do you? Dad left this to me. All of it. This is my house, my money. He clearly trusted me to handle things, not you." I blinked, stunned by the harshness in her tone. "Emily, I raised you here. Every corner of this house has our history in it. Don't you remember? The Christmas mornings by the fireplace, the birthdays in the dining room, the times your father carried you upstairs when you fell asleep on the couch? This isn't just a house, it's our home." Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice sharp. "It was our home. Past tense. Now it's mine. You don't belong here anymore. You don't get to cling to the past just because you're too scared to move on." My heart twisted at her words. Too scared to move on? Emily, I just buried your father. I lost my partner of 30 years. I'm not trying to hold on to the past. I'm just trying to survive. She rolled her eyes, her face hard and unyielding. "You'll survive just fine in that cabin. You always said you loved how peaceful the woods were. Maybe that's where you belong now. Away from all this." I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. "Emily, please, you can't mean that. You can't want me to just leave. I'm your mother. I've always been here for you. I supported you through everything. Your schooling, your heartbreaks, your triumphs. Everything I did for you." Her lips curved into a cold smile. "And now you've done enough. I don't need you hanging around, dragging me down with your grief and your problems. I'm starting my own life, Mom, and honestly, you're just a burden. The word sliced through me, sharper than any blade. A burden. My own daughter saw me as nothing more than weight she wanted to cast aside. I tried one last time, desperation spilling from me. Emily, you'll regret saying this. Family is supposed to stand together, especially now. Please don't push me out. Her patience snapped. She shot to her feet, her face red with anger, and pointed toward the door. Go live in the woods, you useless old woman, she screamed. Her voice rang through the house, echoing off the walls that once sheltered us both. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my chest, her words searing into me like fire. Useless. Old. Unwanted. I had never felt so small, so unwanted, so discarded. The child I had carried in my arms, whose tears I had wiped away, whose dreams I had nurtured, was now throwing me out like trash. My legs moved on their own, trembling as I walked toward the door. I didn't want her to see me cry, but the tears came anyway, spilling down my cheeks as I reached for the handle. Behind me, Emily sank back onto the couch, indifferent, as though she had just taken out the garbage and was done with it. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, and I clutched my coat tighter around me. The driveway stretched ahead, the familiar garden where I had planted roses with Richard now just shadows in the dark. I paused, looking back at the home that had once been my sanctuary. The lights glowed warmly through the windows, but they no longer welcomed me. They belonged to someone else now. Someone who had turned her back on me. I walked down the path, my vision blurred by tears. Each step felt like a farewell, not just to the house but to the life I had believed in, the life where family meant safety, where love meant loyalty. I was humiliated, heartbroken, and utterly homeless, with nothing but the echo of my daughter's cruel words following me into the night. The cabin, the place I had once dismissed as an afterthought, was now my only refuge. And though I didn't know it yet, that cabin would change everything. The drive to the cabin felt endless, though I had only been there once before, years ago, when Richard suggested we might use it as a summer retreat. Back then, I dismissed it as too plain, too far away, too forgotten. I never imagined it would one day become the only place left for me. As the car wound down the narrow road, the forest closed in around me, tall trees looming like silent sentries. Their branches arched overhead, blotting out the moonlight. Each mile pulled me farther from the life I had once known and deeper into a silence I wasn't ready to face. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, my heart sank. The structure stood hunched against the darkness, small and worn, as though it had been waiting decades just to fall apart. The wood was weathered gray, with patches of moss climbing up the walls. The porch sagged under its own weight, the steps creaking as I tested them with my foot. Windows, streaked with dirt and neglect, stared back at me like tired, unblinking eyes. I unlocked the door with a single rusty key Richard's lawyer had pressed into my palm. The lock groaned, resisting me, as though even the cabin wasn't ready to let me in. When the door finally gave way, the smell hit me first, stale, damp, tinged with dust and something older, something buried in time. Inside, the cabin was smaller than I remembered. One room opened into another with no real division. The floorboards creaked under my shoes, and cobwebs draped themselves across the corners like shrouds. The furniture, what little there was, looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. A sagging armchair by the window, a wooden table with one leg shorter than the others, a bed frame without a mattress. Dust coated everything, muting colors, erasing life. I dropped my small bag on the table and sank into the chair. The wood groaned under me, but it held. I buried my face in my hands. Was this really all my life had come to? A forgotten cabin in the middle of nowhere, stripped of the home I had built, the wealth I had shared with my husband, and the daughter I thought would stand by me? The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of the trees outside. My mind wandered to Emily. Her face, her voice, the way her eyes had hardened as she told me to leave. I replayed every word she had thrown at me, each one heavier than the last. Burden. Useless. Old. The words clung to me like chains, dragging me down deeper into despair. I wanted to scream, to demand answers from a world that seemed cruelly unfair. Instead, I sat there, alone, the tears streaming silently down my cheeks. Night crept in quickly. The light from the single bulb above me flickered and buzzed, casting long shadows across the walls. I curled up on the chair, too tired to move, too defeated to care. I closed my eyes, whispering to Richard in the dark. Why, Richard? Why would you leave me with nothing but this place? Did you really think this was enough for me? The silence answered back, heavy and unyielding. But then, as the hours passed, something stirred. A faint sound, almost too soft to notice at first, broke through the stillness. A creak, a shuffle, as if the cabin itself was shifting, breathing. I sat up, my heart pounding. The noise came again, from the far corner, near the wall where the floor met the baseboard. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something inside. I lit the small oil lamp I had found on the table and carried it closer. The shadows flickered, dancing across the floorboards. My fingers brushed against the wall and I felt it, an uneven gap between the boards, almost hidden beneath years of dust. I pressed my hand against it, and the wood gave slightly, not solid the way it should have been. A strange shiver ran through me. What was this? A loose panel? A hidden compartment? My breath caught as I realized Richard had been meticulous about his work. He built everything with intention, with care. If there was a flaw here, it wasn't by accident. I crouched down, running my hands along the edge, my pulse quickening. The floor creaked again beneath me, as though urging me to dig deeper. My grief, my despair, they didn't vanish, but for the first time in days, they were joined by something else. A flicker of curiosity, a whisper of possibility. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the wood, listening. The cabin held secrets. I could feel it. And I would uncover them. I sat on the floor by that uneven panel. My hand pressed against the worn wood, my mind racing with questions. Yet before I dared pry it open, I found myself drifting back in time, pulled into memories I hadn't touched in years. The cabin wasn't just wood and dust. It was a vessel of the past, carrying echoes of moments Richard and I once shared. I remembered the first time we drove up here together, long before Emily was even born. The road was bumpier back then, the trees thicker, but Richard was grinning from ear to ear. He had a vision, always did. He swung open the cabin door with the same rusty key I now held, looked at me with those hopeful blue eyes and said, "It's nothing fancy now, but one day, this place will mean something." Back then I laughed. I told him it smelled like mildew and needed more than a little paint. He just pulled me close, kissed my forehead and said, "Home isn't always about the walls, Margaret. Sometimes it's about the secrets they hold." I brushed his words off as one of his poetic musings, but now in the stillness of that same room, those words echoed louder than ever. I could almost see him again. Young, strong, his sleeves rolled up as he patched a broken step on the porch. I remembered how he'd hum while he worked, that deep, steady sound filling the silence. I remembered standing by the stove as he tried, clumsily, to cook beans and cornbread, filling the air with smoke until we laughed so hard tears streamed down my face. This cabin wasn't lifeless once. It was alive with our beginnings, with the simple joy of being together away from the world. And there were summers when Emily was still a child, when she would run barefoot through the woods, chasing fireflies with a jar clutched in her little hands. Her laughter rang through the trees, so full of innocence, so far from the bitterness she carries now. I'd sit on the porch with Richard, watching her dart between the trees, and he'd squeeze my hand. "One day she'll understand," he'd whisper. "One day she'll see what this place really is." But Emily never did. Somewhere along the way, the magic of this place faded for her. She grew impatient with its smallness, dismissive of its quiet. She wanted lights, crowds, and luxury, not the simple peace Richard and I cherished. I wiped a tear from my cheek, staring around the room as those memories washed over me. The cracks in the walls, the uneven floor, the dust. Suddenly they didn't feel like flaws. They felt like signs, like pieces of a puzzle Richard had left behind. He believed in meaning, in purpose. Maybe he left me this cabin for more than just shelter. Maybe he left me a trail. My eyes lingered on the old rocking chair in the corner. I remembered Richard sitting there with Emily on his lap, telling her bedtime stories while the rain tapped against the windows. I remembered him looking at me across the room and saying, "If anything ever happens to me, you'll know where to look." At the time, I had laughed, thinking he meant nothing more than his toolbox or his fishing rod. But now it felt like a whisper from beyond. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Perhaps Richard had left me more than I realized. Perhaps this cabin wasn't an insult or a burden. It was a key. A place where secrets still slept, waiting for me to wake them. I straightened up, brushing the dust from my hands, a flicker of determination sparking within me. I wasn't ready to give up. I wasn't ready to let Emily's cruelty define the rest of my life. Not when I could still feel Richard's presence in every creak of these floors, in every whisper of these walls. I walked slowly around the room, running my fingers across the furniture, the windowsills, the shelves. Everything here felt deliberate, chosen, preserved. This was more than a forgotten cabin. It was a message, and I was finally ready to hear it. If you believe no mother should ever be treated like I was, please subscribe and share this video. Too many silent stories like mine are hidden. Your support makes sure they're heard. The next morning, I woke to the pale light of dawn spilling through the dusty windows. The air inside the cabin was still heavy with the scent of age, But something in me had shifted. The despair that had wrapped itself around me the night before loosened slightly, replaced with a fragile thread of determination. I remembered the strange panel I had touched, the way it seemed to resist, as though hiding something. And Richard's words, "If anything ever happens to me, you'll know where to look." I rose slowly from the chair, my back aching from a night of restless sleep. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. There was something more pressing than hunger. I found an old broom propped in the corner, its bristles frayed, and began sweeping the dust from the floor. Each stroke stirred tiny clouds that caught the morning light, particles dancing in the air. I wasn't just cleaning, I was searching, feeling, waiting for the house to reveal itself to me. The broom brushed across that uneven patch of floor again, the one I had discovered last night. I stopped, setting the broom aside, and crouched down. My fingers traced the gap between the boards. It wasn't much, just a thin line most would miss if they weren't looking. But now that I knew where it was, I couldn't ignore it. My heart pounded as I dug my nails into the edge, trying to pry it loose. The board resisted, groaning under the pressure. I pressed harder, my fingers slipping on the dust, until finally, with a sharp snap, the wood lifted free. Beneath it, darkness yawned, a shallow space, hidden away, untouched for years. Inside, my eyes caught the outline of something square, wrapped in cloth. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, brushing away the layers of dust. It was a box, wooden, its surface worn but sturdy. The lock on the front had long since rusted, and it gave way easily beneath my touch. When the lid creaked open, the air inside carried a different scent, old paper, leather, and faint traces of ink. I stared down at the contents, my breath catching. Stacks of notebooks, their covers faded, sat neatly inside. On top of them rested a bundle of envelopes tied with twine, each one labeled in Richard's handwriting. I pulled out the first notebook, my fingers trembling as I traced his familiar scrawl. It was a journal, dated decades back. The entries began simply, descriptions of our days together, his dreams for our family, notes about Emily as a child. Tears blurred my vision as I read his words, his voice alive in the lines. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. These weren't just memories, they were plans. Careful, deliberate plans. One entry stood out, written in bold strokes. "The cabin will protect her. What they see as worthless is what will save her." I froze, reading the line again and again. Richard had known. Somehow, he had known this day might come, when I would be cast aside and forced to rely on what others dismissed. My shaking hands reached for the envelopes. Inside were documents, deeds, surveys, papers I didn't fully recognize at first. But as I pieced them together, the truth struck me like lightning. The cabin wasn't just sitting on a scrap of land. It rested at the center of acres upon acres of forest and farmland, land Richard had quietly secured over the years, never once mentioning the true extent of it to Emily, or even fully to me. Deed after deed bore his name, carefully transferred, and now, in bold letters, mine. He had left them tucked away here, waiting for me to find. I gasped, clutching the papers to my chest. My heart raced as I spread them out across the table, the enormity of it sinking in. This land wasn't worthless. It wasn't some forgotten corner of the world. It was vast, valuable, perhaps even worth more than the mansion Emily had claimed. At the bottom of the box, beneath the journals and deeds, lay a small leather pouch. Inside were keys, old, heavy, the kind that belonged to safety deposit boxes. Alongside them, another envelope, thicker than the rest. I tore it open with trembling hands and stared at what spilled out. Bank documents, statements, a passbook in my name. Accounts Richard had opened quietly, building savings, investments, assets I never knew existed. My knees buckled, and I sank into the chair, the paper spread out before me. I could barely breathe, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Richard hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't left me with nothing. He had left me everything, everything that mattered, everything that was truly mine. The grief surged up in me, colliding with awe, relief, and heartbreak. I pressed one of the journals to my chest, rocking gently as sobs poured out of me. I could almost hear him, his steady voice, his calm assurance. "I'll take care of you, Margaret. Even when I'm gone." I wept for the man I had lost, for the love we had shared, for the daughter who had betrayed me, and for the truth I had finally uncovered. This cabin was no curse. It was a sanctuary, a fortress built on Richard's foresight and love. And now it was my turn to decide how to use it. As the tears slowed, a different feeling rose within me. Strength. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt the ground beneath me steady. Emily had thrown me into the woods, certain I would wither away. But what she didn't know, what she could never imagine, was that Richard had armed me with more power than she ever held. I gathered the papers back into the box, my hands firm now, no longer trembling. I looked around the cabin, no longer seeing a prison but a starting point. Emily thought she had cast me into nothingness. She had no idea she had set me exactly where I was meant to be. And one day soon she would learn the truth. The morning after my discovery, I woke with a new kind of heaviness, not the crushing despair that had followed me like a shadow, but the weight of responsibility, of possibility. The papers, the journals, the keys, they had changed everything. The cabin that once felt like a cage now seemed alive with purpose. And I knew I couldn't let Richard's careful planning, his love stitched into every page of those journals, go to waste. The first thing I did was open the windows. The hinges groaned as though they hadn't been touched in years, and a rush of crisp morning air poured in, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. I breathed deeply, letting the air fill my lungs, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could stand without crumbling. The cabin was in disrepair, but it wasn't beyond saving. Dust clung to every surface, cobwebs stretched across the beams, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. But beneath the neglect, I could feel the bones of something strong, something built to last. Richard had left it to me, and I would honor him by breathing life back into it. I began small. I swept until the broom bristles wore thin, pushing years of dirt and leaves out the door. I scrubbed the counters with a rag and water, watching the wood grain emerge beneath the grime. I patched the window where the glass had cracked, and I fixed the latch on the back door with nothing more than a screwdriver I found in an old drawer. Every little repair was a stitch in my own heart, a reminder that I wasn't broken beyond repair either. Outside, the land seemed to call to me. I wandered into the yard where patches of wild grass had taken over, and I remembered Richard's journal entries about the soil, how fertile it was, how he had once dreamed of planting a garden here. I bent to pull the weeds, my fingers sinking into the damp earth. It felt grounding, the dirt clinging to my hands, reminding me of the cycles of growth and renewal. Within days I had cleared a small plot. I planted the seeds I found in an old tin box tucked away in the shed, beans, tomatoes, squash, herbs. I watered them faithfully, whispering Richard's name as though he could hear me in the rustle of the leaves. The garden became my sanctuary, a living connection between me and the man who had known me so deeply. As the days turned into weeks, I fell into a rhythm. Mornings began with the sun streaming through the cabin windows, followed by tending to the garden, repairing what needed fixing, and walking the trails that wound through the woods. At night, I would light a fire in the old stone hearth, curl up with Richard's journals, and let his words wrap around me like a blanket. Slowly, sorrow loosened its grip. In its place grew something sturdier, strength. I no longer wept every time I said his name. Instead, I felt him in the creak of the cabin, in the whisper of the trees, in the way the soil seemed to respond to my touch. Richard hadn't left me alone. He was still here, guiding me, urging me forward. One afternoon, as I carried a basket of fresh herbs to the porch, I noticed a figure walking down the path from the main road. My heart raced at first, fear, suspicion, but as the figure came closer, I recognized an old neighbor, Mrs. Carter. She lived a few miles down and had known Richard for years. She stopped at the gate, her eyes wide. "Margaret? Is that really you?" I smiled faintly, setting the basket down. "It's me." She stepped closer, studying me as though she couldn't believe what she saw. I heard you'd gone. That you weren't well. I never expected to see you here." Her words carried the weight of gossip that had likely spread through town, stories twisted by Emily's version of events. But Mrs. Carter's eyes softened as she looked at me, at the garden, at the cabin that now showed signs of life. "You look stronger than I remember," she said quietly. Her visits became more frequent. Sometimes she brought fresh bread, other times just conversation. Through her, I reconnected with a few others from town. People who remembered Richard fondly, who had always respected the quiet strength of our family. They didn't pry, though I could see the questions in their eyes. I gave them only what I chose to share, holding the rest close to my chest. Their presence mattered more than I expected. Each kind word, each smile, each gesture of support was another brick in the foundation I was rebuilding for myself. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't discarded. I was part of something again, and it gave me the courage to keep moving. Evenings became my favorite time. I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky painted in hues of gold and crimson. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the sound of crickets filled the air. I closed my eyes and listened, feeling Richard's presence settle around me like the warm night air. There were still moments when grief struck unexpectedly, a song drifting from a passing car, a phrase in one of Richard's journals that cut too deep, but they no longer shattered me. Instead, They reminded me of the love I had been lucky enough to know. A love strong enough to outlive death and betrayal. The cabin was no longer a place of exile. It was home. My home. And with every nail I hammered, every seed I planted, every smile I exchanged with a neighbor, I felt myself rising again. Emily thought she had stripped me of everything, but what she had done instead was push me into the arms of a life that was mine alone, rooted in resilience and truth. Richard had given me the tools. Nature had given me peace. And I had given myself the permission to live again. It was Mrs. Carter, with her soft persistence and sharp memory, who first urged me to bring someone professional into the picture. She had seen the papers I was organizing one evening when she visited, and though I tried to brush it off as old family documents, her eyes lingered on the seals, the signatures, the aged legal stamps. "Margaret," she said, leaning closer, "these aren't just scraps of paper. This looks like something that belongs in a lawyer's hands." I resisted at first. My life had been pulled apart by lawyers already, each paper I signed after Richard's death feeling like a noose tightening. But something in me shifted as I thought of Richard's careful planning, of the way he always looked 3 steps ahead. He hadn't left these documents buried under a floorboard by accident. So I made an appointment with Mr. Clark, an attorney Richard had worked with years ago. He was an older man, silver-haired, with the kind of steady gaze that made you feel as though no detail escaped him. When I placed the box of documents on his desk, he raised his brows slightly but said nothing until he'd sifted through the first stack. His silence stretched on as he read, adjusting his glasses, flipping through pages with deliberate care. At last, he set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. "Margaret," he said slowly, "do you have any idea what this is?" My heart hammered. All I know is that Richard left it hidden. He didn't tell me about it directly. Just his journal's hints. Mr. Clark tapped the top page with his finger. "This land isn't just a piece of woodland with an old cabin. Your husband secured mineral rights here decades ago. Do you see this lease?" He held it up. "An oil company has been paying into a trust, waiting for the right conditions to drill. And that's not all. The forestry surveys." He pulled another set of documents forward. "The timber value alone is staggering. Margaret, this land is worth millions." I stared at him, my breath caught in my chest. The word didn't sound real, not in connection with this forgotten cabin I had swept clean with my own tired hands. "Are you saying?" My voice shook. "Are you saying Richard left me more than just a place to hide?" Mr. Clark smiled faintly, though his eyes carried a depth of understanding. "He left you protection. Think about it. He gave Emily the mansion and the obvious wealth. But this he kept quiet, tucked away. I suspect he knew if it went into the open will, it would be contested, fought over, maybe even stolen. By keeping it in your name privately, he shielded you." I sat frozen, tears stinging my eyes. Richard hadn't abandoned me to rot in the woods. He had placed me exactly where I needed to be, in the center of a fortune no one else even suspected existed. A fortune protected from greedy hands. The drive back to the cabin was a blur. My mind raced with numbers, with possibilities, with Richard's voice in my memory. "This place will always be yours, Maggie. Don't ever forget that." Now the meaning behind those words burned brighter than ever. That night, I spread the documents across the table, tracing the signatures with my fingertips. I thought of Emily's cold smirk in the lawyer's office, her dismissive laugh as she called me a burden. She believed she had stripped me of everything, cast me out like yesterday's trash. If she knew the truth, that the worthless cabin she mocked sat atop a fortune, her greed would devour her. I wrestled with myself. Part of me wanted to march into her grand mansion, lay the documents on the marble countertop, and watch her expression shatter. Another part of me, the quieter but stronger part, whispered that silence was power. Richard had trusted me to hold this secret, to guard it. Did I really want Emily's claws tearing into it now? The fire crackled in the hearth as I debated, shadows flickering against the cabin walls. I could almost feel Richard's hand on mine, steady, urging patience. But my heart pounded with conflicting desires, revenge through revelation, or triumph through secrecy. The night stretched long, and I sat there staring at the papers, knowing that whatever choice I made next would change the course of everything. If you're still with me in this story, you've walked through my darkest hours into my strength. Please like and share this. It keeps me going and helps others know they can survive betrayal too. The first knock on the cabin door startled me. It was a sharp, hurried sound, not the gentle tap of a neighbor stopping by with pies or greetings, but the kind of desperate pounding that carries more than impatience. It carries need. I wiped my hands on my apron, my mind racing with possibilities, and when I opened the door, there she was. Emily. My daughter. For a moment, I didn't even recognize her. The woman standing before me was not the polished, confident young lady who once lived in a mansion and waved credit cards like confetti. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes hollow and ringed with shadows. The smirk she used to wear like armor was gone, replaced by something rawer, fear, perhaps even shame. "Mother," she said, her voice low but edged with urgency. "We need to talk." I stood there, taking her in, feeling the weight of every memory between us, her shouting for me to go live in the woods, her smug satisfaction as she inherited what she thought was everything, her laughter when I left with nothing. Now here she was, standing at the threshold of the very woods she had banished me to. I didn't answer right away. I simply stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. My silence was louder than any words I could have chosen. She hesitated, then crossed the doorway into the cabin she once mocked. She looked around, and I saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. The place she expected to find broken and miserable was warm, welcoming, alive. Sunlight spilled across the polished wood floors. Fresh flowers sat in a vase on the table. The smell of baking bread lingered in the air. On the shelves were books, photographs, little touches of love and life that spoke louder than wealth ever could. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to ask how this had happened. But she stopped herself, pressing her arms tight against her chest. "Things haven't been easy," she finally admitted. I sat at the table and folded my hands, saying nothing, letting her speak. "The money," she shifted in her chair. "It didn't last the way I thought it would. The house, the upkeep is insane. Taxes, repairs, everything adds up. And I may have spent more than I should have. Trips, clothes, investments that went wrong." She glanced at me, her eyes searching for sympathy. I didn't realize how fast 5 million could go. Her voice cracked on the last words, but I remained quiet. I let the silence stretch. She grew fidgety under my gaze, her shoulders tightening. I need a little help. Just until I get back on my feet. You understand, don't you?" I wanted to laugh, not out of cruelty, but out of the cruel irony of it all. She had once thrown me out with nothing but bitterness in her eyes, and now she sat in the very cabin she mocked, asking for mercy. But I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. Instead, I studied her with calm patience, the way a mother studies a child who still doesn't understand the consequences of her own choices. "I see," I said finally, my tone steady. "You've had a rough time." She leaned forward, relief flickering in her expression, thinking I was about to agree to her request. But I simply rose from my chair and moved to the window, looking out at the garden I had tended with my own 2 hands. The silence stretched again, filling the cabin with a weight she couldn't escape. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tapping the table. You're doing well here," she finally muttered. Her eyes swept the room again, noticing the subtle signs of comfort, of stability, of quiet wealth. The small details that spoke of a woman who was not just surviving, but thriving. Her voice faltered. "You're happier here than I thought you'd be." I turned back to her, meeting her eyes. I didn't need to tell her about the documents, the investments, the fortune hidden beneath the soil she thought was worthless. I didn't need to flaunt what Richard had safeguarded for me. My peace, my strength, my dignity. Those were my riches. And they were shining clearly enough for her to see. She swallowed hard, her bravado crumbling. For the first time in years, she looked small, like the child who once clung to my hand when she was frightened. But the years had taught me that pity was not always love. Sometimes the truest love was the refusal to rescue someone from the consequences they had brought upon themselves. "Emily," I said softly, "this cabin has given me more than I ever expected. It has given me clarity. It has given me peace. And it has shown me that I can stand on my own." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw shame wash across her face. She wanted to ask about the life I had built, wanted to pry into the quiet strength that baffled her, but she couldn't bring herself to. I didn't lecture her. I didn't remind her of the cruelty she had thrown at me, though every word of it still lived in my bones. I didn't list her mistakes or hold her failures against her. I let the silence speak. I let my calm presence, my quiet thriving, become the mirror she had to face. She shifted again, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think it would be like this. I thought." She trailed off, her pride fighting her vulnerability. I said nothing. I only poured myself a cup of tea, the sound of liquid filling the silence like a drumbeat of truth. I placed the cup on the table, but I didn't offer her one. Her eyes darted to the door, her breath quickening. For the first time, she was the one who felt unwelcome, the one who felt like the outsider. Finally, she rose to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. "I should go," she muttered. I nodded, my expression neutral. "Just peace." She walked to the door, her shoulders heavy, her steps slower than when she arrived. She paused once, her hand on the handle, as though waiting for me to call her back, to soften, to rescue her. But I didn't. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud, and I stood there for a long time, breathing in the silence she left behind. That silence was my revenge. Not loud, not cruel, not vindictive, but powerful. A silence that reminded her of every word she once threw at me, now bouncing back at her in echoes she could not escape. And as I turned back to the warmth of my cabin, I realized the truth. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need her apology to reclaim my worth. My very existence, calm, thriving, untouched by her greed, was the justice I had longed for. My revenge was not in destroying her life. It was in living mine fully and without her chains. And as the fire burned in the hearth, steady and bright, I knew Richard would have smiled at the choice I made. There are nights when I lie awake, listening to the wind whispering through the trees around the cabin, and I think about how far I've come. Betrayal has a way of cutting deeper than any wound on the flesh. It settles in the soul, carving scars that never truly fade. And for a long time I thought those scars would define me. I thought my story would always be about the daughter who cast me out, the home I lost, the cruel words that still sting in my ears. But I was wrong. Losing everything I thought I needed forced me to uncover what I had carried inside all along. Strength, independence, the quiet dignity of survival. When Emily slammed that door behind me and told me to rot in the woods, she believed she was destroying me. What she never realized was that she was pushing me toward the very place where Richard had hidden not just a fortune, but a future. This cabin, these walls, these trees, this land became my teacher. Here I learned how to breathe again after grief. I learned how to work with my hands, how to coax life out of the soil, how to sit with silence without feeling broken by it. Each day brought me closer to Richard, as if he were walking beside me, guiding me toward the woman he always knew I could be. He didn't leave me with scraps. He left me with resilience, with security, with a legacy that could never be touched by greed. And so while Emily's betrayal gave me pain, Richard's love gave me power. Power not measured in dollars, but in the ability to stand tall, to live without begging for scraps of love or validation. Power in the choice to forgive silently, without granting her the satisfaction of my anger. Sometimes I wonder if Emily ever truly sees it. If she realizes that my silence was the answer she could never bear to hear. If she understands that her cruelty, in the end, became the very thing that freed me. Because in losing her, I found myself. I am not the broken woman who walked away from a mansion with tears on her cheeks. I am the woman who turned an abandoned cabin into a home. Who unearthed secrets meant to protect me. Who learned that peace is far more valuable than possessions. And so, as I close this chapter of my story, I hold on to one truth that will never leave me. She told me to go live in the woods, and I did. But in those woods, I found myself, my peace, and my justice.